Hey there, Old Testament scholars. Welcome to lecture number 19. We're still on wisdom literature and we're looking at the books of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. You'll note that traditionally many people believe that Solomon was the author of these two books. But we'll get into that in a little while. It's less likely that he wrote Ecclesiastes, but again, we'll get into that later. First off, let's start with Proverbs. So the book of Proverbs is a list of wisdom sayings and also conversations. A book like this was very common in the ancient Near East, and there are several cultures that we can see that made similar contributions. It's even said that wisdom literature as a genre may have originated in ancient Egypt as early as the year 2000 BC. Wisdom literature can also be found in a number of different locations. For example, the Hittites, which occupied ancient Anatolia or modern-day Turkey, had their own body of wisdom literature dating back to perhaps 1600 BC. One of the Proverbs says, and it's interesting, so listen up here. One of the Proverbs says, "If a building collapses, you can rebuild it. If a farm erodes, you can replant it. If a chariot breaks down, you can repair it. You are not a building. You are not a farm. You are not a chariot." So, wisdom literature loves to use short sayings like this to impart universal truth to the readers. And the book of Proverbs does this really well. So, overall, Proverbs can be broken down into two sections. The first section is chapters 1 through 9, and is labeled as being a series of short discourses. It's in these chapters that the author of Proverbs uses dialogue and lectures to inform the listener, almost like a parent sitting a child down and giving counsel to the child. Many ascribe this portion of the book to being a form of just parental counsel. And if you read those chapters, you'll see that that's very much the case. For example, it warns you to stay away from bad influences, right? And that makes sense. It also tries to explain how to find real joy and real happiness in this life and not just pleasure. As we discussed in a previous lecture, a major theme of the wisdom movement in Israel is provided in Proverbs chapter 1, verses 7, which says, "The fear of the Lord," or the awe of the Lord, "is the beginning of real wisdom." By using this saying, Israelite wisdom literature is trying to say that the search for meaning, the search for success, the search for happiness in life is not an autonomous human enterprise, even if a particular counsel seems secular and centered on human assessment and effort. Proper recognition of God's claim to the world and God's self-disclosure is crucial for readers and for sages alike. The rest of the book of Proverbs, chapters 10 through 31, are much less conversational. They're comprised primarily of classical two-line sayings or proverbs. Concerning genre and style, the proverbs found within chapters 10 through 15 are perhaps most notable, though they employ what's often called antithetical parallelism. And if you were in my Theo 110 class, you'll remember that we studied different kinds of parallelism. The antithetical parallelism provides examples of what scholars call a two-way doctrine, which explains how the wise and righteous preserve their life, while their counterparts, the foolish and the wicked, engage in self-destructive behavior. So here are a couple examples of antithetical parallelism in action. In Proverbs 11:6 we read, "The integrity of the upright delivers them." Okay, so there's the first half. The integrity of the upright delivers them. The second half, treacherous folk are done in by their plots. So do you hear how the upright and the fools are compared and contrasted in this verse? Here's another one. Chapter 10, verse 4. "A slack hand leads to poverty. A hand at work results in gain." So overall, it's this use of antithetical parallelism that gives the book of Proverbs its unique feel. And you get these over and over again in this second two-thirds of the book of Proverbs. Let's move on and look at the book of Ecclesiastes. Previously, we mentioned that Solomon may have been the author of these books in addition to the book of Proverbs, but this has been proven to be a little bit controversial. The author of the book is said to go by the name of Koheleth, which is stated pretty on in the text. And in Hebrew, the word Koheleth means teacher or preacher. So the question of whether or not Koheleth and Solomon are the same person is, helps us to think about, well, is Solomon the author or is Solomon not the author? Many people say yes on the basis of the first person accounts in the book, which claim to be from the perspective of Solomon. Other scholars say that it's doubtful that Solomon is the author due to the post-exilic style of the narration. Since Solomon lived well before the exile, he wouldn't have employed post-exilic terms. This debate continues to go back and forth because, that's what scholars do. They debate about things like this. Either way, most are in agreement that the style expresses a Solomonic worldview and was at least influenced by him. Overall, the book of Ecclesiastes can be seen in 4 parts. The first part is chapter 1, verses 1 through 11, and it's an editorial introduction. In this section, the author emphasizes the importance of work and how to balance work and pleasures. The next part is chapters 1:12 through 2:26. This is when we get Solomon's first-person narrative reflecting on life and wisdom in general. The third part of the book is the longest part. It's chapter 3, verse 1 through chapter 12, verse 7. This section opens with a really well-known poem starting with the often-quoted saying, "There is a season and a time for all matters under heaven." A question follows the poem saying, what gain is there for human workers in all of this? The answer is a confessional reply about what God has done in making things appropriate for their times, just as the opening poem proclaims. God has also put a sense of eternity in the human heart. These are all things that God has done, yet human perception is not capable of beginning to grasp all of these things. In other words, appropriately timed events do indeed happen, but as humans, we may well not detect them. Lastly, part 4 is an editorial conclusion found in chapter 12, verses 8 through 14. The last 2 verses are summary in nature, but leave plenty of room for the exercise of the imagination. The initial command to fear God is formulaic for the wisdom movement and may initially seem out of character with the book of Ecclesiastes, and with other elements in this book. It's followed by the command to keep God's commandments, which is another formulaic counsel. Overall, the book of Ecclesiastes is trying to express the grand mystery that God will use the future to assess matters. Even if matters seem opaque in the present, in other words, we don't understand everything about everything in the present, the future is in God's hands and will be different. In short, it's trying to say that the fact that humankind cannot figure out God's plans does not mean that God does not have plans and that there will not be future reckoning. So again, it's this kind of wisdom that is speculating on, is God in control, even though we don't always understand what God is up to.